4 at TV. The world is thinking.
One of the reasons for my interest in this subject is accounting frameworks do affect behavior. We saw that in the United States in the 90s, where people have bad accounting, and that affected their behavior. Some of what we're going on now is a reflection of bad accounting. So more generally, information affects behavior. And so what we gather our information about, how we describe success, affects what we strive for. If GDP is what we think is success, people will strive for GDP. And political leaders all the time say, look at what we've done. They always put it, I've succeeded in getting the economy to grow at 6%. Now, what he did is hard to figure out, but that's the politician does that. I've created X million jobs. So that's part of the political rhetoric. The question is, by doing that, they focus policies on things that will increase GDP. There's actually, in forming the commission, we've identified a large number of ways in which GDP is not a good measure of economic performance or societal well-being. And so what we're trying to do is partly to focus the global conversation about these other measures, but also come up with some summary counting frameworks and statistics. So let me just mention a couple of them. One of them I've already alluded to, which is GDP doesn't tell you about what happens to the typical citizen. And this is an increasing problem because when you have growing inequality in society, you can have GDP going up, as it has been in the United States, but most people getting worse off. Not just poverty going up, but the median income, 50% or more of people getting worse off. So that's one example of a metric. We ought to know what's happened to the median person. It's very hard to find statistics about that across countries. One of the things that I tried to, when I was at the Council of Economic Advisors, tried to generate was a focus on green GDP. That is to say, to take account of environmental degradation and resource depletion. This is particularly important in developing countries that may be growing by cutting down their forests, but once they cut down the forest, there's nothing there. And so unless they do something, it's not sustainable. GDP tells you nothing about sustainability. Another example is GDP measures. IMF thought Argentina was doing great in the early 90s. I happened to look at the data in a more fine-grained way, and we said, this is not sustainable. If you only looked at GDP, you would not have realized that. So in the first context, there are ways that you can take out for depletion of natural resources and degradation of the environment. If you do that, China's growth gets significantly lowered. It's still doing well, but it is much lower than it otherwise would have been. Interesting story about the role of special interest. When we tried to push for this, and people in the Department of Commerce were excited about doing this, the coal industry basically passed a proviso, or threatened to pass a proviso, to take away funding for any research that would support these alternative measures. Because they knew that green GDP would not be good for the coal industry. So, to me, that reinforced my belief why it's important to measure these things. Another example, just is the difference between GDP and GNP. Those of you who are older, when you went to school, you talked about GNP. GNP, right. And about 1990, they switched to GDP. Well, everybody said, oh, just a little bit of difference. Well, it turns out that it makes a great deal of difference for many countries. And there is a little bit of, I'm sure somebody's going to write an article about whether there is a political context to the switch. GDP looks at the output within the country. GNP looks at the income of the people in the country. Well, when you started privatizing a great deal, you had economic activity within the country, but the income from that economic activity more and more going to people outside the country. So you have a mine, somebody taking a mine in the country, leaving behind environmental degradation, royalties in some cases of 1 or 2%. So almost none of the income from the mine goes to the people in the country. So GDP is going up, but any measure of green GNP would show the country going down. And some really dramatic examples, like in Papua New Guinea, where this actually is true. So there are other aspects of health, leisure, the fact that, just to give you two other dramatic examples, the United States, as you may know, has about 10 times as many people per capita in prison as other advanced industrial countries. That contributes to our GDP because we have to spend money incarcerating them. And some states now are spending as much on prisons, construction of prisons, as they are in universities. Well, that's good for GDP, but any measure of societal well-being says it's not good to have so many people in prison. And it's a symptom of something dysfunctional. We can have a long discussion about what it is that's dysfunctional, but it's not positive. Another example is we spend more on health care than any other country as a percentage of GDP, and our health outcomes are much lower than in other advanced industrial countries, and actually lower than many developing countries. Well, the extra money that we spend on health care shows up as a contribution to GDP. If we got more efficient, our GDP could go down. Well, that's clearly not, you don't want to, you're looking at the wrong thing. And so I think this will provide a good forum for thinking a lot more about the strengths and weaknesses of each of our societies.